What left this mark?
What if I told you a boy who couldn't move until Bigfoot looked him in the eyes? Noah Merrick, 15 years old, paralyzed from the chest down, silent for over a year, moved his hand for the first time not in a hospital, but in the misty valley of Stillwater Hollow, with a creature the world calls a myth. But here's the truth no one tells you. Some wounds can't be healed by medicine, only by presence. And the creature we fear, the one everyone wants to capture or kill, knelt down to a boy's level and taught him to live again, with nothing but 2 twigs on the ground. This is not folklore. This is the story of a mother who watched her son come back to life, a federal agent who was saved from wildfire by a beast he once swore to destroy, and a boy who learned to speak again, through silence. Watch till the end, and you'll discover how empathy can come from the most unexpected place, how healing can begin without words, and why 3 lines drawn in the dirt can mean everything. Don't skip this, because sometimes the most sacred thing you'll ever witness doesn't speak. It simply stays. The road curled like a faded ribbon through the pine country north of Yak, just before the sun gave up on August. Dust lifted in dry plumes behind the old Chevy as it rattled over the ruts of Red Meadow Road, one headlight blinking now and then like a tired eye. Rachel Merrick gripped the wheel tighter with one hand, the other resting lightly on the brake. Her knuckles were pale, not from fear, but from the weight of everything they were leaving behind, and the silence beside her. She glanced sideways. Noah hadn't spoken a word in over 20 minutes. Not that she expected him to. He sat in the passenger seat, back slouched against the battered cushion, legs curled up beneath a wool blanket, wheelchair strapped in the bed behind them. His eyes followed the trees as they passed, but not like a boy curious about the world, more like someone who used to be curious and wasn't anymore. The air inside the cab held the last of summer's heat, but Rachel didn't roll the window down. The trees were too dense here. The forest on both sides too quiet, like it was listening. The tape deck spit out a half-swallowed song and fell back into static. Rachel clicked it off with a sigh. "Almost there," she said out loud. It was more for her than for him. The word "there" had stretched thin over the years. They'd been almost there in hospital rooms, therapy offices, school meetings. Now it meant a one-room outpost cabin deep in Larkspur Ridge, where a friend of her late uncle's said she could work as a seasonal wildlife tracker and keep the place rent-free. "Just you and the boy?" he'd asked on the phone. "Yes," she'd said. "Just me and my boy." A bump jerked the front tire. Rachel tapped the brake. Noah didn't flinch, didn't move. He hadn't moved much since the fall, since the branch broke and the ground rose too fast and the nest spilled out of his hand. His spine had snapped so quietly, she said later, like someone cracking a pencil in a library. That was nearly a year ago. The rest of him worked. His brain, his voice, his hands. But he didn't use them much. He was 15 and had the silence of someone twice that. Up ahead, the road dipped. A shallow bend curved toward the riverbed. Rachel slowed as the gravel faded to dirt, then to silt. The truck rocked to a slow stop. "Hold on," she murmured, eyes narrowing. Something wasn't right. The ground shimmered slightly from a patch of moisture, maybe where the river had overflowed days ago, and in the damp sand, something wide and deep pressed down like the memory of a step. She opened the door. The warm smell of pine and dust met her first. Then the hush. Not quiet, but hush, like someone had whispered right into the trees and told them to stop. She stepped out slowly, boots pressing into the earth, walked toward the mark with the careful gait of someone who'd tracked things before but had never seen this. It wasn't a bear print. She knew those. She'd cleaned up after bears. This was wider, the heel sunk deeper. 5 toes, rounder, flatter, splayed like it held weight differently, like it knew where it was putting its foot. Her eyes darted to the side, then up the embankment. No other marks, just this one, singular, intact, still fresh. She knelt beside it, hand hovering just above. Her breath hitched. Not fear, not exactly awe either, a kind of reverence. She didn't touch it. Behind her, the truck door creaked open. Rachel stood and turned. Noah had pulled himself forward in his seat, his back straight, not slouched, not fallen into himself like usual. He stared past her, not at the trees, not at her, but at the footprint. His chest rose and fell once, sharply, and she thought he might speak. He didn't, but his gaze had changed, focused, sharp, as if some old wire in him had sparked. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. Not once, but twice. Then he did something she hadn't seen in months. He lifted his hand, slow and trembling, and pointed toward the ridge. Rachel followed the line of his finger. The slope lifted away in the direction of Larkspur, a wall of old pine and cedar, thick as fur. At the top, wind stirred the high limbs. A pine cone dropped. Then nothing. But there was a rhythm in the stillness. Not silence, just waiting. She walked back to the truck, opened the door. "Want to keep going?" Noah's eyes flicked to her, then back to the ridge. He didn't nod, but he didn't turn away either. He shifted in his seat, as if some small part of him wanted to sit up straighter. Rachel watched him. Something passed over her face. Relief, or maybe the memory of it. They drove on. The sun had begun to lower, brushing gold against the pine bark. Shadows stretched thin across the road. Rachel kept both hands on the wheel now. She didn't talk. She didn't need to. She could feel something in the cab had changed. Not a miracle, not a cure, but a pause in the quiet. Like someone had tapped gently on the door of Noah's mind and left a trace of warmth in their wake. The road narrowed, then widened again into a flat clearing marked by an old gate made of rusted steel and cedar posts. A wooden sign swung loosely above. Larkspur Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. The letters faded, a slash of moss across the R. Rachel pulled through, stopped near the tool shed, and killed the engine. Evening slid in through the trees. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a woodpecker knocked twice, then went quiet. Noah looked out at the trees. He didn't say a word, but his fingers curled slowly against the seatbelt strap. Rachel stepped out and moved to unstrap the chair from the truck bed. She paused for a moment, just before lifting it down, looked up the slope toward the darkening trail. Her breath caught for a beat. The trees moved again, just a little, and then held still, like someone had slipped through without touching a branch. She didn't say anything. She didn't want to spook it. Or herself. The chair touched down with a soft thud. She wheeled it to the passenger side and opened the door. Noah looked at her. She nodded. He nodded back. They didn't speak, but the hush around them deepened, stretched long into the pines, and far down the ridgeline. Something old and watchful settled into its place. The forest did not give answers. It never had. But sometimes, if you stopped long enough, it let you ask questions without words. Noah settled into the chair. His hands rested on the armrests. Not limp, not stiff, just there. Rachel stepped back just a little. His head turned toward the trail. Then, faint but clear, a bird called once. Then silence again. But the silence was different now. It was listening. And so was he. The air had changed overnight. Not colder exactly, but heavier, as if the trees had pulled something ancient out of the soil and draped it across the valley. Mist clung low along the hollows, not rising like smoke, but sinking, coiling in the grass and around the edges of tree roots like it was afraid to leave. Dawn hadn't broken so much as crept in, washing the thicket in grays and dull whites that softened everything except the sound of the riverbed shifting far below. Noah sat still as stone, his back against the broad porch post, wrapped in 2 layers of wool. The wheels of his chair braced against the warped boards. His breath made a faint fog in front of him. One hand rested open on the armrest, the other limp across his lap. His eyes were fixed on the open space beyond the porch, where Stillwater Hollow yawned into a sloping field of tamarack and alder, swallowed in mist. The wheelchair hadn't squeaked that morning. He'd rolled it out quietly on his own, careful not to wake Rachel. She'd been so tired the night before she hadn't even finished her tea. He found it still warm by the window, next to a stack of old forestry maps she'd tried to make sense of before nodding off. The cabin smelled like pine and cracked varnish. He didn't want to be inside anymore. There was a sound. Not close, not loud, but there. He didn't flinch. He blinked once and listened again. It had a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like the creak of a branch under pressure, not from wind, from weight. Then a scrape. Then stillness. He didn't move. He just watched. The edge of the clearing, where the alder thinned and the blackberries twisted low to the ground, began to shift. Not in a sudden way. In a way that felt like the forest was breathing in. Something moved through it without sound, though everything around it seemed to react. Branches curled back slightly. Mist parted as if startled. And then it stepped forward. Noah's breath caught. It was taller than he thought anything could be. Not just tall, wide, massive across the shoulders, but not hunched like the cartoons or the campfire stories made it out to be. It stood straight, but there was a weariness in the way it moved, like it carried weight deeper than muscle. Fur covered its whole frame, not shaggy, not wild, but dense, colored like the earth itself, dark brown streaked with mossy green and patches of gray along the sides, like weathered bark or lichen-covered stone. The mist seemed to cling to its outline. The head tilted slightly, eyes shining, not red, not glowing, but a dark amber gold, catching the faint light like a wet river stone. It took one more step, slower this time. Noah noticed the limp. It favored the right side. Slight drag. A hesitation in the stride. There was a scar, thick and pale, curling from just above the knee up toward the hip. Old, crusted with hair that didn't grow right. A wound that never healed all the way. A trap, maybe. Noah knew that kind of limp. He saw it once on a rescue dog in town, the way it moved like it remembered being caught. But this creature didn't snarl, didn't crouch, didn't charge. It sat down. It didn't crash into the ground or slump like a beast would. It lowered itself slowly, like someone with bad knees or an old memory of pain. And when it settled, legs bent awkwardly, arms resting on them like a man in thought. It was at Noah's eye level. They didn't speak, of course they didn't. But something passed between them. The creature didn't lean forward. It didn't reach out. It just sat, breathing in the same cold air, watching the same hollow. Noah's fingers twitched. The hand on the armrest curled just a little. The creature blinked. Noah's chest ached, not in the way it used to, when the spasms would hit or the breath wouldn't come, but in that quiet, hollowed way that sometimes happened when a person remembered being something else. Before. Whole. His other hand moved, slowly, uncertain. The fingers lifted a few inches off his lap and hovered. He didn't wave. He didn't point. He just let them be seen. The creature shifted. One massive hand, gnarled and padded like the bottom of an old work glove, rested on its own knee. It didn't mimic the motion, but it didn't hide either. They sat like that. 10 seconds. 20. Then, from the porch, behind the screen door, a floorboard creaked. The creature's head turned, not fast, but with a kind of deep awareness, like it had already known she was there. Rachel stood frozen, one hand still gripping the edge of the screen. Her eyes were wide, but not panicked. Her breath was caught in her throat. She didn't scream. She didn't run. Her gaze bounced between her son and the figure before him. Then it locked on Noah's hands. They were shaking. Both of them. Not violently, not in fear. Alive. She hadn't seen them move like that in over a year. Not since that day at the clinic, when the doctor said the chances were almost zero. Not since he'd refused to touch the therapy clay, or the pencil, or the old guitar she'd tried to put in his lap. But now, his fingers curled again. His chest rose, and his eyes, those deep, unreadable eyes, were locked onto something. Someone. Rachel covered her mouth, not to hide a scream, but a sound that had no shape. Relief, grief, wonder. She blinked fast, but her body didn't move. The creature stood. Not fast, not threatening, just steady. It didn't turn its back. It moved sideways, backward, then into the mist again, every step careful, measured, like it knew what silence meant. Noah sat still. The only motion was in his hands, now resting together in his lap, fingertips pressed against each other. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. Not yet. Rachel stepped forward slowly, her boots brushing pine needles off the porch. She knelt beside him, not too close. Not like she was going to fix something, just close enough to feel his warmth. He didn't look at her. His eyes were still on the edge of the woods. She placed her hand on his gently. It was warm. It was shaking. But it didn't pull away. The mist began to lift with the slow rise of sun behind the ridgeline, staining the upper treetops with gold. Far off, a hawk called once and wheeled overhead. Noah blinked. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far inside the trees. Rachel didn't speak. She wouldn't break it. Whatever had passed through that morning, it hadn't come to be explained. It had come to be seen, and something in her son had answered. The wind had begun to change. Not fast, not cold, just enough to rustle the edges of things, like it was brushing its fingers through the maple trees before slipping off down the hollow. It was the kind of October morning that blurred the lines between summer and what came after, when the air smelled faintly of wet stone and distant wood smoke, and the leaves didn't fall so much as let go. Along the edge of Stillwater Hollow, red and gold drifted gently down into the slow-moving creek, catching in soft clusters against the roots of the alder trees. The ground was damp but not muddy, and the trail that ran behind the cabin curved like a question mark through the undergrowth. Noah's wheels made hardly any sound on the pine needles, just the soft crackle of dried twigs as he maneuvered along the edge of the clearing. His hands were stronger now. Not fast, not perfect, but steady. He didn't speak as he moved. He didn't need to. The forest around him seemed to breathe in rhythm with the turns of his wheels, as if it recognized him now, not as a stranger, but as someone who belonged. He stopped near a patch of moss where the ground dipped slightly and leaned forward, eyes scanning the soft earth. It was there. 2 sticks, placed side by side, not fallen, not natural, arranged. Noah stared. They weren't big, maybe 12 inches long each, snapped from the same branch, smooth along the break, laid carefully in parallel over a patch of mossy soil. Not touching, but close enough to mean something. He looked up toward the tree line, but there was no movement, just a stillness that felt aware. He reached down slowly, fingers brushing the dirt, and without really knowing why, he picked up a 3rd stick from the ground nearby, thinner than the others. Lighter. He hesitated, then gently placed it between the other 2, but not straight. Angled. A bridge. His chest tightened. Then, almost before he knew it, he smiled. Not wide, not forced, a real one. It startled him a little, the way it felt after so long. Like something that hadn't cracked in him in months finally shifted. He sat back in his chair, hands in his lap. looking at the 3 sticks like they were the answer to a question no one had asked out loud. Behind him, a voice called out, "Morning, young man." He turned slowly. A woman stood near the split-rail fence that bordered the west side of the clearing. Late 60s, maybe, with wind-bitten cheeks and a dark green ranger's coat that hung loose around her shoulders. Vera Colton. He'd seen her once before, from a distance, talking to Rachel near the shed. But this was the first time she'd spoken to him directly. "Mind if I join you a sec?" she asked, nodding toward a tree stump not far from where he sat. Noah shook his head. She made her way over, boots crunching gently over the fallen needles. She moved like someone who knew the woods. Quiet feet, eyes scanning more than they let on. She sat slowly, resting her gloved hands on her knees. "Pretty out here," she said, glancing toward the creek. "Best time of year, if you ask me. Forest gives up its secrets in the fall. Everything's shedding something." Noah said nothing, but he didn't look away. Vera glanced at the sticks, tilted her head slightly. "Did you do that?" He shook his head. She nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. Not in suspicion, more like understanding. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "I spent 40 years in these woods. My husband, too. He was a cutter before we took over the preserve. Had a good eye for bad trees. Used to say you can tell a lot about the forest by the way it lays things down, and a whole lot more by the things it chooses to pick up." Noah followed her gaze back to the pattern. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a coil of rusted wire, thin, sharp, and frayed at the end. She turned it slowly in her fingers, the way someone might handle a snake's shed skin. "Found this tangled under a cedar up near the ridge," she said. "Old snare, buried under leaf fall. Illegal, of course, but not uncommon back in the day. Lot of pain buried out here." Her voice went softer. "I knew a creature once. A coyote, maybe a fox. Used to limp near the fire road. Always came around dusk, never let anyone get close. But it never missed a meal either. Smart one. Learned how to live with the wire still inside its leg." Noah's hand twitched against the wheel. Vera's eyes softened. "Some things keep moving forward even when they shouldn't have to," she said. "It's not fair, but it's real." They sat for a moment in the hush, broken only by the rustle of leaves. Then Vera stood, brushed off her pants. "Looks like someone's trying to say something here," she said, nodding toward the sticks. "Maybe they don't know how to write it, but maybe you do." She gave him a slow smile, then turned and walked back toward the fence. Noah looked back at the 3rd stick, the one he'd placed. It hadn't shifted, but it meant something now. That afternoon, something else changed. A young man named Todd was out near the old observation station. He was one of the seasonal volunteers. College kid, camcorder slung over his shoulder like he thought he was filming a nature documentary. He'd been curious since day one. Asked too many questions. Spent more time wandering off trail than checking the species log. Rachel had warned him once already to be careful where he pointed that camera. He'd nodded, mumbled something about just wanting to get the real story. That evening, he came back to camp flushed and out of breath. Said he'd seen something by the hollow. Not close, not clear, but enough to catch on tape. He showed Vera the footage first. Her mouth went tight when she saw it. A boy in a wheelchair, and something behind him. Massive, partly shadowed, motionless. The image was grainy. VHS didn't do justice to the scale, but the shape was undeniable. Broad shoulders, bent knees, a presence. Todd grinned. "I mean, we could go national with this. You know how many sightings are all blurry junk? This is clean. It's real. People need to see it." Vera's voice dropped low. "This isn't yours to show." Rachel found out the next morning. She didn't yell. She didn't panic. She stood very still, hands curled into fists at her sides. Todd shrugged. "It's out of my hands," he said. "I already sent it to a guy at the station in Kalispell. Channel 9, I think. Maybe 7. Doesn't matter. They're interested." Rachel didn't answer. She just walked away. That night, the forest was louder than usual. owls calling from closer branches, a fox yipping down near the bend, and something heavier moving along the ridge, not hiding, just pacing. In the morning, someone had rearranged the sticks near the creek. Not two, not three, just one, long, bent at the middle. It looked like a question mark, or a warning. Noah stared at it for a long time. Then, gently, he placed a hand over his chest, felt the beat, felt the pause, felt everything starting to change again. The cold came in sudden, carried on a wind that hadn't been there the night before. Not a storm wind, not loud, but thin, sharp, the kind that slipped through seams and settled into the bones. Rachel noticed it first when she stepped out with her coffee before sunrise and saw the frost clinging to the grass like breath held too long. The hollow looked different under this kind of sky, the clouds low and pale like pressed cotton, and the birds hadn't started yet. She wrapped her coat tighter and listened. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt suspended, like something was waiting to land. That was the morning she found the mailbox full of letters with names she didn't recognize, and one thick manila envelope from Channel 7 News, Kalispell, addressed in slanted black marker to residents of Larkspur Ridge. She didn't open it right away, just held it there against her chest for a minute, the corner crinkling against the rise and fall of her breath. She already knew. Something about the way the mist didn't move, the way Noah hadn't come to the porch, the way the woods felt like they were holding themselves still. She turned slowly and walked back inside. That night, the living room glowed faintly blue in the flicker of the old television screen. They hadn't used it in weeks. Reception barely worked without dragging the antenna wire up the flagpole outside, but Rachel had managed it with a length of twine and 3 clothespins. Noah sat quietly in the chair across from her, wrapped in the same gray blanket he'd used since the first week. His face was unreadable, but his eyes hadn't left the screen once. The newscaster's voice came through staticky, clipped. Still no official comment from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But the footage, now verified by multiple sources, shows what appears to be a humanoid figure in proximity to a teenage boy using a wheelchair. Captured near Stillwater Hollow, the VHS tape has sparked both awe and outrage statewide. They played it again, Noah on the edge of the clearing. The shape behind him, enormous and silent, framed by trees and morning mist. No words, just the tape humming. Rachel glanced at him, waiting for something. A flicker of fear, shame, even anger. But Noah just stared. The camera lingered too long on the frame, paused, zoomed, as if trying to make the unknowable into something quantifiable. The screen cut to a news anchor's face, polished and composed. We've received dozens of calls since the segment aired this afternoon. Some viewers describe the moment as miraculous, a sign of peace between species. Others express concern about public safety and urge state officials to take action. Another voice followed, a caller from Missoula, older, raspy. I say if it's real, it's a threat. Look, I live near the Bitterroot, and I've heard stories going back 40 years. These things ain't fairy tales, they're dangerous. That boy's lucky to be alive, if you ask me. Rachel muted the volume. The room went quiet except for the fire. Noah didn't move, but his breathing had changed. It was slower now, steady, measured, as if he was choosing each breath carefully. Rachel stood up, walked to the side table, and pulled a stack of paper from the drawer. Her hand trembled a little as she took out the letter Noah had written that afternoon. Not typed, not dictated. Written, every word in his own hand. She didn't read it again. She'd already memorized it. But she could still feel the weight of the pencil lines, the way his fingers had gripped just hard enough to form each letter without breaking it. He hadn't said much when he handed it to her. Just looked at her and nodded. She mailed it to the Kalispell Daily Gazette the next morning, with a small note paperclipped to the top. For Voice of the Valley, please read in full. They did, and within 2 days, it had been reprinted in papers as far as Billings and Spokane. It read, There is a creature in the woods who does not speak. It does not wave or bark or howl. It simply is. The first time I saw it, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the fall. Not fear, not surprise, just recognized. Like maybe I wasn't broken, just quieter than the rest of the world. This being, whatever it is, didn't want anything from me. It didn't demand I get better. It just sat. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to move towards something again. If you're reading this and you're scared, I understand. But please don't hurt what you don't understand. Please don't send men with guns into the trees looking for something sacred just because it doesn't fit in a file. This creature gave me back something I didn't know how to ask for. I'm just a kid, and I know that doesn't carry much weight, but it should. Below that, it was signed in shaky, uneven pen, Noah Merrick, age 15. The reactions came fast. Phone calls, letters, visitors parked at the edge of the reserve's boundary line, holding cameras and telescopes, staring into the woods like they expected something to walk out on cue. Not everyone was gentle. Some came with questions. Others came with rifles in their trucks. Rachel spent most days walking the perimeter now, clipboard in hand, taking notes that didn't matter and talking to Vera over the handheld radio. Vera had become something like a lighthouse. Steady, quiet, firm. She kept the volunteers in line, reminded them why the preserve existed in the first place. But even she couldn't stop what came next. A letter from Helena. Official seal. Department of Wildlife and National Conservation Oversight. They were sending a team, not rangers, inspectors. Federal. Rachel stood in the cabin doorway holding the letter, wind tearing through her coat sleeves, eyes scanning every line like they might rearrange themselves if she stared hard enough. They were coming to assess the potential biological anomaly and determine the risk of exposure to the public and surrounding ecological systems. She folded the paper slowly, fingers stiff. Noah was watching her from inside. She met his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't know what to say. At dusk, when the sky turned the color of old copper and the light hit the tops of the tamarack just right, she walked out to the edge of the creek where the sticks had once been placed. They were gone now, washed away in the last rain. Or taken, but the earth still held their memory. 2 lines, then a third, now only silence. She stood there for a long time, the cold creeping into her boots, until Noah rolled up beside her. He didn't ask what was in the letter. He didn't need to. He just looked at the ground, then back at the trees, and somewhere far beyond the branches, something moved. Not toward them, not away, just shifted its weight. Waiting, listening. The wind picked up, and carried something with it that neither of them could name. Not yet. The snow had come early, blanketing the ridge in silence before the trees were ready to let go of their last leaves. Tamaracks still held tight to their gold needles, caught off guard by the storm, like someone interrupted mid-sentence. The sky pressed low, lead-colored and still, the kind of sky that makes people whisper without knowing why. Wind hadn't moved through the hollow in hours, but something was coming. The first tire tracks cut through the snow just after dawn. 6 black Suburbans, crawling up the access road like a line of beetles, engines grumbling against the cold. Rachel stood on the porch, arms crossed over her coat, eyes fixed on the trees beyond them, not the vehicles. She hadn't said much that morning. Just helped Noah into his chair, packed 2 thermoses of black coffee, and cleared the porch of last night's drift. She hadn't touched the envelope pinned to the cabin door, left there by a courier in the dark, but she didn't need to. She knew who was leading the team before they arrived. Wardell Price, 52, tall, wide frame, hair still mostly black but streaked at the temples, coat collar turned sharp against the wind. He stepped out of the first vehicle and scanned the tree line like he expected it to blink. The others followed, tight-faced, jackets too clean, clipboards, cameras, radios. They moved like people who didn't come to listen, Wardell adjusted the strap of his sidearm but didn't touch it. He wasn't here to shoot. He was here to measure, to assess, to decide. Rachel stepped forward. He looked at her once, didn't smile. "You're the mother." She nodded once. "And the boy?" She tilted her head toward the porch. Noah was already waiting at the edge of the ramp, wheels half turned toward the path, blanket tucked over his lap, eyes locked on the tree line. He hadn't spoken yet today. He hadn't needed to. Wardell scanned the area. Trees, frost, the remnants of a fire pit half covered in snow. He cleared his throat like he meant to say something official, but what came out was smaller than that. "Place looks quiet." Rachel didn't answer. She didn't trust what might come out if she did. The inspection team set up quick, tense, motion sensors, trip cameras with infrared. They moved like a unit, crisp and impersonal, dragging wires across earth that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Vera showed up before noon, coat dusted in flurries, boots stiff with ice. She didn't speak to the agents, just gave Rachel a look, long and steady. Then she walked the perimeter alone, counting the new tracks in the snow. By mid-afternoon, Wardell stood on the edge of Stillwater Hollow, radio in hand, earpiece coiled under his collar. He hadn't spoken to Noah directly. Not yet, but he watched him. Long glances, studied the way the boy's head tilted slightly to the right when he was listening. The way his hands rested gently on the wheel spokes, not gripping. The way his breath frosted just once every 10 seconds. He was memorizing him, Rachel noticed. So did Vera. That night, the wind picked up. Not harsh, just constant. It moved through the trees like a tide, curling snow off branches in slow spirals. The moon didn't show, just a long stretch of dim gray light that made the forest glow from beneath. And sometime just after midnight, the sensors went quiet. No alarms, no buzz, just stillness. Then, one by one, the trip cameras shut off. Wardell rose from his cot without a word, pulled on his coat, slipped out of the tent like someone remembering a dream too clearly. He didn't wake the others. He didn't take a flashlight, just followed the path toward the hollow. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but when he reached the edge, Noah was already there. In the snow, under the leaning pine, the boy sat alone. No blanket, no hat, just his coat, his wheels, and his stillness. And across from him, maybe 15 feet away, stood the thing none of them were supposed to understand. Not moving, not hiding, just there, massive, still, watching. The creature didn't flinch when Wardell approached. Didn't step forward. It simply lowered its body, the same way it had weeks earlier, the same way it had in the video. Down to one knee, slow and careful, until it was eye level with the boy. Noah didn't blink. The snow between them held no prints, only the lightest mark from the wind. Then the creature did something different. It reached behind itself, dragged something forward, a log. Weathered, old, nearly hollowed from rot. It rolled the log once, slow, deliberate, and pushed it toward Noah. Stopped just short of his chair, not close enough to touch, just near enough to be seen. Noah stared. Then, with his right hand, he reached down, and in the snow, he drew a curve. Long, smooth, almost a question mark. But then he extended the line, past the bend, deeper into the white, toward the mouth of the canyon. Wardell felt something shift in his ribs. Not fear, not awe. Memory. A flash, a smell. His brother's face, half covered in dust, the moment before the logs gave way. The scream that never fully left his ears. He shook once, blinked it away. The creature looked at him. Not directly, not threatening. Just long enough. Then it pressed its hand, massive, wide, padded, into the snow beside the drawn curve. Palm down. 5 fingers. Held. A mark. Not a print. A presence. Wardell stepped forward without realizing it. The sound of his boots in the snow felt louder than the world. He stared down at the mark, at the curve, at the log. Noah looked at him. Not pleading, not proud. Just steady. Waiting. The wind shifted again, a faint whistle through the tamarack. Then the creature stood, walked backward, disappeared between two fir trees. Didn't run, didn't vanish, just left. Wardell turned to Noah. His throat felt tight, like he'd swallowed a stone too long ago to cough up. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Later, when the team gathered for morning report, he didn't mention the visit, didn't write it in the notes, didn't explain why the cameras had failed. But when Vera asked him what he planned to recommend, he stood still for a moment, then said one sentence. "We need to leave them be," the others argued. "Cited protocol, safety, public pressure." Wardell didn't raise his voice. He just wrote a single line in the report. "Subject demonstrates intelligence, restraint, and possible benevolence. Recommend no pursuit. Designate area as protected under extraordinary clause." He signed it, dated it, closed the folder, and for the first time in years, didn't feel the need to justify a damn thing. That night the snow deepened, and the ridge held its breath. But no one spoke of war anymore, only the quiet, only the log, only the handprint still visible at dawn, untouched by wind. The smoke came before the flames, a long gray smear across the sky, stretching low above the ridge like someone had torn the horizon with a blade and let the ash spill sideways. No thunder, no lightning, just heat, dry and creeping, the kind that worked its way under bark and into breath. They hadn't expected it this early. A freak storm in the bitterroots had tossed dry strikes westward, and now a dozen small fires were feeding off weeks of brittle grass and bone-dry needles. The one on the western slope of Larkspur had doubled in size overnight. They called it a brush fire. But out here, with only one road in and no clear way out, Rachel knew what it really was. A wall. The scent of it reached the preserve before dawn, thin and sour. Not wood smoke. Not yet. More like old plastic or dried sage scorched too long in the sun. Vera was the first to confirm the fire jump. She'd gone up the south rim to check the wind and saw the flame cresting 2 hills over. When she came back, her coat was singed along the hem, and her voice had dropped an octave. No panic, just resolve. "We need to move, now!" The fire line was climbing fast. Rachel took inventory out loud, voice clipped. 5 volunteers, 1 wildlife vet, 2 kids from the high school program, plus her and Noah. The radio squawked with reports from Kalispell Dispatch, but the roads were choking. Trees already down along the main service route. Smoke from the north cut visibility to less than 10 yards. "We've got one way," Vera said, pointing west. "Stillwater's dry. If we follow the creek bed, stay below the ridge, we can slip past the western tail." "Down the gorge?" one of the volunteers asked. "Exactly where the boy mapped it," Vera said. Her eyes flicked to Noah without softening. Every turn of it. Rachel pushed the wheelchair into place. Noah was already bundled, blanket tied tight, goggles around his neck. He didn't speak, just nodded once. They moved quickly. Down through the edge of the orchard, past the old weather station. Smoke dragged in sheets across the sky now, blurring the light into a strange copper haze. The air felt wrong, hot and hungry. Trees cracked in the distance. Dry explosions of limbs snapping, one after another. Wardell had stayed behind at the lower compound to help pack up gear. When he heard the second crack echo across the ridge, he started running. He reached them near the dry well, out of breath, eyes red from smoke. "They blocked the road," he said. "Came down faster than they thought." Vera didn't hesitate. "We go down the hollow." He hesitated. Looked toward the ridge, toward the columns of rising black. Then he looked at Noah. The boy's hands rested calmly on his lap, fingers tapping slowly, like he was remembering a beat. They started down the creek bed. It wasn't a smooth path, rocks like broken teeth, roots twisted like ribs. But the chair held. Rachel and Wardell on either side, Vera behind. The smoke was thicker now. No flames visible yet, but the heat pushed down hard, as if the fire was breathing from just above. Then the wind turned. A gust tore through the hollow, hot enough to sear the tips of Rachel's hair and send two of the kids stumbling back. The fire had shifted. A flank had broken off and was now crawling down the ridge behind them. The hollow twisted at a tight bend where the stones narrowed and the creek bed rose to meet a rock wall. They stopped. The air felt like it was boiling. Wardell moved ahead to scout the gap. Vera checked the radio again. Dead. Battery fried. Rachel wiped sweat from her eyes and looked up the slope, and saw him, standing on the ledge above them, framed by smoke, silhouetted against the burn. Bigfoot, not in shadow this time, lit from behind by flame glow, larger than anyone had imagined. Not just tall, but wide, thick across the chest, arms like trees. His fur shimmered with ash, tips glowing faintly orange where the heat licked close. His head turned slowly. Not frantic, not afraid. Then he raised one arm and pointed. Not a wave, a direction. Then he stepped back, turned, and vanished into the haze. Rachel didn't blink. She grabbed Noah's chair and pulled hard left, following the direction. Wardell caught up in 3 strides, helped maneuver the wheels over the roughest stones. The others followed. The hollow opened to a narrower trail, a dry channel that veered east, hidden under brambles until the creature cleared the brush ahead. Limbs snapped under his strength. Rocks rolled aside. He led them, down, past a crooked pine split by lightning years ago, through a thicket that smelled of sage and clay, then along the base of a crag that shielded them from the worst of the wind. They passed under a low canopy of alder and pine. Smoke hung above them, but hadn't dropped here yet. The fire roared somewhere behind, but distant. When the trail narrowed again, nearly closing in around them, the creature stopped, turned to face them, looked at Noah. No words, just a pause. And then he stepped aside, stood tall against the rising heat, blocked the wind as it curled down the channel. One hand braced against the rock wall, the other shielding the narrowest part of the path, holding the heat back, just long enough for them to pass. Each person moved by slowly. Noah last. He tilted his head upward, met the creature's eyes. Something passed between them. Recognition, a kind of thank you that lived beneath language. Then the creature stepped back into the heat, and was gone. When they reached the bottom of the hollow, the air cooled. Smoke thinned. The trees opened into a shallow basin of moss and stone, untouched. Sunlight cut through the ash overhead, weak but real. They collapsed in place. Some cried. Some didn't move at all. Wardell stood a long time with his back to the others, staring back up the slope. The wind had shifted again. The fire hadn't followed. Later that night, in a makeshift camp 10 miles south, Wardell pulled a folded form from his pack. It was the emergency designation paperwork for the preserve. He wrote in black ink, Larkspur Ridge designated as Open Access Therapeutic Zone. No clearance for removal. Recommend continued observation only with local presence. Recommend protection of subject. He paused, then added one more line. Trust was demonstrated. He signed it. Date, October 22nd, 1987. The ink bled slightly on the corner, where ash still clung to his gloves. Noah slept soundly that night for the first time since the fall. The wind outside had died completely. But up north, somewhere beyond the ridge, a figure stood in silence, watching the stars come out, one by one, above the blackened trees. Spring came in slow this year, as if it didn't trust the ridge anymore. The snow didn't melt all at once. It receded in thin sighs, pulling back from tree roots and hollow stones like a body learning to breathe again. The rivers ran shallow and hesitant, but wildflowers still found their way through. White blooms dusted the edge of Yak River like scattered milk across the banks. And where the Stillwater curved gently below the ridgeline, the earth had begun to soften, taking footprints again. Noah sat near the edge of the bluff, not far from where the pines thinned into sky. His chair tilted slightly forward, one wheel braced against a root, the other locked with a stick he'd wedged beneath. He wasn't bundled anymore. The coat lay open, The blanket tucked behind him, unused. The wind tugged gently at his sleeves, but he didn't shiver. He was reading. Not a book. His own pages. A stack of wide-ruled paper, dog-eared and folded in places, some stained with pine sap or old coffee. His handwriting wasn't neat, but it held shape now. He turned the page slowly and began to speak. Not loud, just steady. And sometimes, he read, the quiet is louder than words. Sometimes just sitting beside someone who knows what it's like to be misunderstood is enough. You don't have to explain the hurt. You don't have to fix it. You just have to stay. He paused, looked out toward the river. The students gathered behind him were silent. No rustling, no coughs, just breath and wind and a few birds arguing in the cottonwoods. Rachel sat off to the side with Vera, who leaned back on her elbows in the grass, squinting into the light. Noah continued. They called it a miracle, but it wasn't. Miracles are flashy. This was quiet, sacred. It was about presence, being seen, not saved. His voice didn't shake. Afterward, the kids clapped. Not loud, not polite, just enough. Noah nodded once and folded the pages back into his lap. The smallest girl in the group, a wiry thing with dark hair pulled into a too-tight braid, raised her hand even though no one had asked for questions. Rachel glanced over, eyebrows lifting. Noah turned toward her, and the girl lowered her hand slowly, unsure. "It's okay," he said. "You can ask." Her voice was almost a whisper. "Did it really sit with you? Like, that close?" He thought about it. "It didn't just sit with me," he said. "It matched my stillness, like it understood it wasn't supposed to fix me." The girl blinked, looked down. Her name was Tess. 12. Known for not speaking much. Known for flinching when someone looked her in the eye. She'd come with her mother on a weekend open day, part of the new therapeutic access program Wardell had signed into law that winter. Rachel had helped coordinate the bus. Vera had vouched for the cabin accommodations. And Noah had asked that the edge of the hollow be cleared just enough for kids who didn't always trust the world to see it for themselves. Tess sat near the end of the bench, her mother behind her, hands resting on her shoulders. They both wore the same jacket, faded denim patched at the elbows. She looked down again when Noah's eyes met hers. He didn't press. Later that day, after the group had broken for lunch and the teachers wandered toward the creek, Noah wheeled himself to the edge of the thinned path. Rachel stood beside him with her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. "I think she wants to come down," he said. Rachel followed his gaze. Tess was standing near the start of the trail into the hollow. It wasn't much of a path, just grass flattened by careful feet and a few old branches tied with survey tape. But it led to where Noah always said the boundary was. Not a fence, just a feeling. A respect line. Tess looked back once, saw them watching, and froze. Then Noah whispered, "I'll wait." Rachel stepped back. Tess turned again, looked toward the hollow, and took one step, then another. No one followed. She moved slow, arms tucked tight against her sides, breath short. The woods opened gently in front of her. The sun had dipped enough to soften the light. Everything glowed in shades of gold and green. The path curved where the roots reached out, then straightened near the tree with the old burn mark along its side. She stopped just shy of the bend and waited. Rachel held her own breath from up on the ridge. Vera didn't speak. Noah leaned forward slightly. The woods were silent. Then something shifted. Not a sound, not movement, just presence. At the far edge of the clearing, where the ferns dipped low and the light didn't quite touch, a shape formed, tall, still, watching, not approaching, just standing. Its head tilted, not in confusion, but in something that looked almost like tenderness. Tess didn't run, didn't cry. She raised one hand, small, uncertain, and let it hover in the air. Then lowered it again. She stepped forward once more, half a step really, and stood there. The creature didn't move, but the tilt of its head shifted again. It had seen her, and it stayed. Noah closed his eyes. Tess looked back once. Her mother hadn't moved. Then she smiled, barely, and sat down right where she was, on the edge of the moss. The creature turned, slow, deliberate, and disappeared behind the trees. But it didn't leave fast. It lingered just long enough. Later, when the group loaded back onto the bus and Rachel handed out the leftover trail mix, Tess didn't flinch when someone sat beside her. She just looked out the window and whispered something her mother didn't hear. Noah watched from the porch as the taillights vanished down the trail. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But he'd felt it. That something had shifted again. Not just in her, but in the space between. The hollow didn't belong to stories anymore. It belonged to voices, even the ones that hadn't found their full sound yet. The wildflowers came back first. Not the loud ones. Not fireweed or goldenrod. Just the soft kind, larkspur, pale violet, small enough to miss unless you were really looking. They covered the far field in loose waves, stretching toward the pine line like they were reclaiming something that had never been theirs to begin with. The air hung warm with late summer weight, but the wind still moved like spring, careful, cool along the skin, as if it remembered what had burned. A hawk circled high, slow and wide, casting a drifting shadow across the slope before vanishing into sun. Larkspur Ridge had changed. Not on the map, not in the paperwork, but in the hush. In the way the forest breathed slower now, and in the way people spoke softer near Stillwater Hollow, like they knew they were standing in someone else's church. Noah returned in August. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. Rachel had seen him packing the night before, folding things too neatly, checking the wheels on his chair twice, tucking his worn field journal beneath a flannel shirt. And she only asked, "You sure?" He just looked at her, hand resting on the edge of the suitcase, and said, "Yeah." The road was rougher now, not from neglect, but from disuse. Since the fire, most visitors kept to the edge of the preserve, afraid to disturb what had gone quiet. The exemption had been renewed for another year, stamped and sealed and buried somewhere in Helena's government files. But Rachel didn't carry that paper with her. She carried the silence Noah had earned. The weight of it. The promise inside it. He arrived just before sunset. The cabin still stood. New boards along the south wall, a replaced window on the east. But everything else was exactly as he'd left it. Pine needles on the porch. Rust on the gate latch. That same creak in the ramp when the left wheel dipped. He didn't mind. He spent the night alone. Didn't start a fire, didn't unpack much. Just sat on the old porch, hands resting on his lap, eyes on the tree line, and listened. The next morning he wheeled himself back to the place where it all began. Stillwater Hollow was quieter than before. Overgrown in places, yes, but not unwelcoming. Ferns curled up along the banks like sleeping dogs. The creek bed was dry again, as it always was in late August. The stones warm to the touch, smooth from years of storms and sun. And there, beneath the old pine near the bend, he stopped. He took a breath, then leaned forward, reached into the grass, and broke two thin stems of larkspur. They bent easy. He laid them down carefully. Not straight, not random, just side by side, parallel, like tracks, like memory, like two beings that never truly touched, but always moved toward each other in silence. He stared at them for a long while. The wind didn't move them. He didn't expect anything to happen. That wasn't why he came. It was about finishing something, about saying the part that didn't need to be said. He turned slowly, rolled back up the slope. The trees shimmered gently in the breeze, and the air carried the faint scent of resin and moss. When he reached the trailhead, he paused to look back one last time. Still nothing, still quiet, still sacred. He turned again, hand on the wheel, then stopped. Not from sound, not from movement, but from feeling. That weight in the chest that presses like gravity, that sense of being seen. He looked into the mirror clipped to his chair, and there it was. Not the figure, not the face, just the hand. A massive, fur-covered hand, reaching in from the edge of the frame, slow and gentle, placing a third stem down beside the two he had left. No noise, no breath, just presence. Noah didn't move. He didn't need to. He looked forward again, chest tight, not with fear, with knowing. Then he pushed off, wheels crunching lightly over dry pine needles, the rhythm slow, steady, full of something that didn't need to be named. That night, back at the cabin, he pulled out the field journal, the one he hadn't opened in months. Pages dog-eared, smudged, maps of trails long since erased by storms, doodles, questions, and at the end, a short story he'd written but never shared. It was called Parallel Lines. It wasn't long, just a few pages. The last line read, "Some wounds don't close. They recognize each other, move beside each other, not to heal, just to keep going. And sometimes that's enough." He closed the book, laid it on the windowsill, and watched the dark settle over the ridge like a soft blanket. Far off, a branch snapped once, not loud, not threatening, just real, a sign of life. Noah didn't turn. He just whispered into the dark, like a promise. "I remember." And the dark held him like an answer. Not goodbye, just a shared breath between old friends. Between one boy who had once fallen, and something older, wilder, who had chosen to kneel beside him. Between two silences that had once run parallel, and, just once, had curved toward each other. Sometimes, the things that save us don't speak our language. They don't show up in grand gestures or loud miracles. They arrive quietly, in a glance held too long, a branch placed in the dirt, a presence that doesn't ask us to change, only to be. In a world that so often demands noise and explanation, there is something profoundly human in the act of simply being there for one another, of standing beside someone's pain without needing to fix it, of listening to silence and still choosing to stay. We live in a time where value is too often measured in speed, achievement, or how much we can produce. But healing doesn't move like that. It moves like rivers in winter, like breath in cold air, like parallel lines, slowly learning how to bend. Sometimes, the most powerful change comes not from pushing forward, but from pausing, long enough to hear the rustle of larkspur in the wind, or the slow, steady rhythm of another heartbeat beside our own. And maybe that's the lesson we forget too easily, that not everything broken wants to be made whole, and not every silence is waiting to be filled. Sometimes, the deepest kind of understanding comes not from speaking louder, but from softening our voice until it matches the hush of the forest, until we can feel what someone else cannot say. In that quiet space, between what was and what could be, there's room for something else to take root. Not resolution, not perfection, but respect, mercy. The decision to walk more gently, to look more closely, to believe in something bigger than ourselves, even when we can't explain it. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lost, or something you've almost forgotten, take a moment, sit with that, let it breathe, and when you're ready, share what it meant to you, down in the comments, or out loud to someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to be part of more stories like this, stories that honor silence, that celebrate quiet courage, that find the sacred in the shadows, make sure you follow the channel, subscribe, and turn on that little bell so you don't miss what comes next. Because sometimes the stories we choose to hear are the ones that help us finally feel seen.